Hi, SOS 4610. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you did well with the first week of online learning. And I hope you're just adjusting to social distancing. I know you're probably all in different places right now under different guidelines. Some of you may have more restrictions than others. I actually live outside of Atlanta, so I have a long commute to campus that I only make probably 3 days a week. But we're under shelter in place right now, so that started Sunday. So the biggest impact of that is that the kids can't really go outside and play with their friends, and that's been kind of what's kept everybody, all the kids and parents in the neighborhood, sane. So we're only on day 4 of that. Okay, well, we've made it 4 days, but that's been the hardest impact. I know some of you are posted messages letting everybody know how you're doing, what you're up to, and some of you have been affected more directly than others. Some of you have friends who have been affected pretty directly. One of my grad students who works on my research team has a family member with coronavirus sheltering, being isolated in her house. So she says they've kept this person in like a separate end of the house, and it's been about 10 days and nobody else has caught it. So hopefully they're out of that. They've made it through that buffer. I mean, aside from all the challenges, interesting things happen. Sunday, Zane clogged the toilet by trying to flush a whole roll of toilet paper down the toilet. When there's no toilet paper in the world right now. She tried to flush a whole roll of toilet paper down the toilet, so that was fun. Ryan tried to give himself a haircut, which I knew when he started. I told him, don't try because you're going to ask me to finish it or fix it, and I'm not qualified to do that. And that's basically what happened. He came in and asked me to finish it, and he said he couldn't reach the back of his head and he needed me to do the back. And when I looked, there was a big chunk out of the back of his head, which he still refuses to accept is there. So I told him he already put a chunk in the back of his head, and he swears he didn't do it because he couldn't even reach back there. But there's a chunk out of the back of his hair, out of his hair, the back of his head. Anyway, so I hope you all are trying to stay on some sort of schedule to keep yourself sane, get outside when you can, and get ready for the day. I say that. My kids are actually in their pajamas right now playing, like watching TV. This is not a typical day. They decided this week to make Tuesdays teacher in-service days, teacher work days, so they don't have to do any work. So they're actually not ready, and it's 12 o'clock. But it keeps you sane. All right. Feel free to post a comment on the discussion board if you want to check in with the class and let us know how you're doing. And then I will get on to business now and go over the slides for gender and family. I will try not to talk as long as I did last time. Good luck with that. But I'll try to make it a little shorter than I did last week. Okay, so gender and family. If you look at the first slide number 2, the first slide with text. Paid and unpaid work. I actually touched on a little bit of this in my video last week when I talked about that kind of splitting of spheres after the Industrial Revolution, mainly because I was talking about how it changed marriages, gender roles, households, and so forth. But in agrarian society, you had men and women both working typically out of the home on their own property and so forth. But then when we had the Industrial Revolution, we had this splitting of spheres. Home became the private sphere, and then there was the public sphere, where typically men went out to work at factories and so forth for wages. So that's when we had this beginning of this, like, women at home in the homemaker role and men out in the professional field making money. Before that, women were very productive, and when I say productive, I mean creating goods in the home in terms of like food and so forth, actually creating sustainable goods. But then with the split, we see home became more of a sentimental place, where it was more about caring for this safe haven rather than like creating goods for need and survival and so forth. So that's where we had this kind of division between paid and unpaid work, where the overall trend being men going out for the paid wages, women working at home without direct compensation. Again, we see differences here. This is typically, this is going to apply overwhelmingly to white families who had a good quality of life. In situations where people are less advantaged, then you may see women going out and working for paid wages. Okay, so what happened is this unpaid work that got created in the domestic sphere, in the private sphere, became undervalued. Not to say it's not work that is that requires a lot of effort and can be draining and so forth, but just that we tend to not value things that don't produce money as much as we value work that does produce money. So as time went on, we see this division melting away a little bit, where we don't see everybody in this mid-century typical male breadwinner, female housewife, caretaker, so forth role. We see a lot of different arrangements, but we see those things kind of mixing together where there's not like a rigid divide so much anymore. What that results in is what is called a second shift. That refers to the second shift of work that somebody completes after they check out of their job for the day. So you go to work for paid wages, you come home, and then that's when it's time to cook dinner, help kids with homework, clean, do laundry, and those sorts of things. That happens in dual earner households. It's not as likely to happen in households where you have a breadwinner and then somebody who's at home taking care of the home and children, because that person who's taking care of the home is doing all those things, or at least the vast majority of those things. But the second shift emerges where you have two people who are working for wages, and so when they're done with that paid work, then they've got to do this unpaid work, which can be difficult for people to manage. It can feel like you're working all the time. All right, slide 3. Looking at kind of contemporary patterns in this paid and unpaid work, we can see two different trajectories here: specialization and sharing. Specialization is more common than sharing in most relationships, whether that's a same-sex couple or a mixed-sex couple. Specialization is where paid and unpaid work are split so that each partner does more of one than the other. So somebody primarily makes the money and somebody primarily takes care of the house and family members and so forth. So some subtypes under this are traditionalists and neo-traditionalists. Traditionalists are what we think of with that mid-century ideal, where a man makes the wages and a woman is responsible for home and family, taking care of the house and kids. Neo-traditionalists, that's basically how it sounds, like new traditionalists. They believe essentially that a woman should be able to work and make wages as long as it doesn't interfere with taking care of household duties and children. And same-sex couples have more flexibility with deciding what arrangement to make, essentially because they don't have kind of the long-standing norm of expectations that's been handed down over time. But we see that even in same-sex couples, typically there's some specialization where somebody does more paid work, somebody does more housework. All right, so sharing is the other option to specialization, and that's more or less like an even split between paid and unpaid work between partners. So egalitarians do a lot of sharing. Okay, my Roomba is beeping behind me right now. That's good timing. I hate Roomba. Anyway, Roomba ate my laptop cord today too. So anyway, okay. Egalitarians prefer relationships where both partners do a pretty equal mix of breadwinning and housework, child rearing, and so forth. Now, the important thing to remember there is that it's almost equal. It's actually really hard to find couples where it's absolutely equal. There's this concept of peer marriage that Pepper Schwartz came up with several years ago. And in her work, she wanted to interview couples who had this peer marriage, where it's an absolute even split of paid and unpaid work, and she really couldn't find them. So what she loosened her definition to accept it to a 60-40 split, and she found a good number that fit into that. And then she started calling them near peer marriages. But she said essentially she couldn't find peer marriages, so she studied near peer marriages. And so basically the point of that is to say that it's really difficult to find an exact 50-50 split. So for the most part, 60-40, 40-60, which is essentially the same thing, just in different directions, is kind of the cutoff where researchers will say that somebody does or does not have like an egalitarian split of responsibilities. Most young people today have preference for egalitarian relationships. So let's look at that on slide 4. These graphs are from the Pew Research Center, and I've got a link at the bottom if you want to look up the reports in more detail of where these graphs came from. But the Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan research firm that does a lot of research on like public opinion and trends. They use random telephone surveys of Americans. So what we find is, looking at the chart on the left, both men and women place a high value on parenting. So this chart shows the percent of men and women who say that certain activities are very meaningful. And if you look at childcare, it's pretty even. Mothers, 63% say that, and for fathers, 60% say that. So that's pretty close. So both men and women think that child rearing is important, meaningful, should be fulfilling, and so forth. That would be a change that from 50, 60 years ago, you would not see very many men expecting childcare to be very important. And if we were in class, we could talk about this a little bit, but I mean, based on my discussions with previous classes, most men in the room expect to have a pretty involved role with their children when they have children. So that's a newer trend. And that's where we see kind of the ideal being pretty equal in terms of thinking like men and women both are going to be pretty involved with kids. Now, so looking at the next chart, this shows how exhausted mothers and fathers feel with various roles. And we see these are all pretty low percentages. We don't see a ton of people saying they're exhausted. But within this subsample of people who are saying that they feel exhausted with these tasks, we see the biggest difference between men and women on childcare and then also housework. So we're talking about child rearing right now. We see that mothers are there are about twice as many mothers who say that they feel very tired from childcare compared to fathers. So if we were in class, we would probably spend a little while talking about what this means, and just to kind of expand upon that without putting words in your mouth. Usually a conversation will go somewhere to the point of that our ideals aren't really fitting with reality. So both men and women essentially expect to be involved, think parenting is very important, but you see women being more exhausted by it, which could be a sign that that the ideal is not matching reality, that they tend to take more responsibility for it and feel more overwhelmed by it. Looking at slide number 5 again, so contrasting reality and ideals in terms of egalitarianism. This again is from the Pew Research Center. There's a link to where you can get more information on that. So breaking down how moms and dads actually spend their time. Mothers are on the left and fathers are on the right. And we see that they're spending, pretty comparable time on leisure, both between like 25-30%. But if you look at paid work, we see a big difference. That's the dark green color there, with fathers spending a lot more time on paid work. And then if you look at the next two above that, that's housework and childcare, we see mothers spending a lot more time on housework and childcare. So again, if we could talk about this, what does this mean? Basically, a big picture being that our ideals don't always translate into practice. So Most young adults do want a pretty even split where fathers and mothers are pretty equally involved. Again, it's not always going to be 50-50, but maybe that's 60-40 with childcare, and then also with contributing to income through paid work. But in reality, we don't really see that panning out. We see more fathers engaging in paid work, and then we see more mothers engaging in housework and childcare. Okay, so going to slide 6, again, these are from the Pew Research Center. Okay, so what are mothers and fathers doing when they're doing housework? On the left, we see how they divide their household chores, and then on the right, we see how their time is spent with children. So on the left, how they divide household chores. What differences do we see here? Mothers are the light green, fathers are the dark green. We see this is how many hours a week they're spending on this. Mothers are spending about 7.5 hours cleaning compared to fathers spending about 2. Mothers are spending 7.1 hours cooking compared to fathers spending 2.7. Management, which would probably be like financial management, setting up appointments for repairs or for services like lawn services or pest control services, things like that. We see closer, but fathers doing more of that than mothers. Fathers 1.7 hours, mothers 1.4. And then with actual physical repair work, not like management of making appointments, but actually fixing things around the house, we see fathers doing more of that than mothers. So 3.9 hours for fathers versus 1.1 hours for mothers. So here we see some very gendered patterns in what mothers and fathers are doing in their actual households. On the right, we're looking at what they're doing essentially with kids. And again, because we're talking about mothers and fathers here, this pertains to couples who have children. And that's a big point that I think I should make a comment about, that we actually see a lot of times when a couple has children, gender norms become a little more rigid than beforehand. And some of that just has to do with practical things or just the way society is structured to support that. You could have very egalitarian homes, but once you have kids, certain decisions are made in terms of, well, if somebody's going to stay home, sometimes it's the dad, but usually it's the mom. She's typically going to make less money, and she's been more socially expected to do that, more so. We don't expect all mothers to stay home, but that expectation is stronger for mothers than fathers. So we see those types of decisions being made. And then there's the implicit assumption a lot of times too, in terms of like if you get emails from your kid's school or correspondences from your kid's school, they will typically, contact mothers before fathers, with that kind of being the expectation that that's the primary parent. And so we see these things kind of shaping, like once you have kids, then you do sometimes fall into more sort of these more typical quote traditional. I say quote because it, like I said, it kind of hasn't been the same throughout history, but our recent history expectations. Okay, so after that meaningful digression, how do mothers and fathers spend their time with children? So physical care, this is basically like supervision and taking care of basic physical needs, just supervising, feeding kids, getting kids ready for the day, things like that. We see mothers doing about 5 hours, fathers doing about 2 hours a week. And then for managerial, mothers more there, and that would be managing things like scheduling doctor's appointments, scheduling meetings at school, dentist appointments, and just events and so forth. And then we see a close to even split with recreation. And then with education, we see mothers spending about 2 hours and fathers spending about an hour. I look at my household, a lot of this is pretty consistent except with education. Actually, Ryan tends to work with Asher on his homework more than I do. But then with everything else, I would say that's pretty accurate for us. I'm going to rethink it a little bit and say on physical, I would say I still do more, but we're closer. The gap's closer than it is in this graph. Okay. All right, so talking about, again, this difference between ideals and reality. One of the reading that was posted to Canvas for this week was an article by Kathleen Gerson, who studies gender and families. It's an article called Falling Back on Plan B, and that's essentially what it sounds like, that young people tend to want egalitarian relationships, but it doesn't always happen. And so in her research, she found young men and women actually proactively kind of coming up with this Plan B, in almost like knowing that their ideals weren't necessarily going to work out. So she conducted interviews with men and women between the ages of 18 and 32, and she wanted to explore their reconciliation of their desire to achieve an egalitarian relationship and satisfying work with the realities of gender, fragile relationships, and uncertain job prospects. So just to give some context, this article, it was reprinted in 2017, but I believe it was originally published in 2010. So that was about 10 years ago. And so I think what she was interested in is looking at the idea of and maybe this is meaningful now, again, with what's going on with the economy with the pandemic, but just where the economy was 10 years ago in terms of what your job prospects might look like out of school and so forth. She was interested to see how knowing you may not have great job prospects would affect your plans for relationships and family. So family structure. When the adults in her sample thought back on their family of origin and how that may or may not inform their desires, they really weren't so much concerned about structure in terms of like whether their parents were married or divorced, who lived in their household, as much as just how well things functioned. So they were really concerned just about the dynamic and how things functioned and how people got along. So for example, some of the participants in her sample, in addressing some of her later research questions, talked about how they didn't want to be in a bad relationship just to be in a relationship for support. And so that would maybe go back to family structure with your parents might be married, but if they're fighting all the time and nobody's happy, these participants didn't necessarily want to reproduce that. They were more concerned about how things functioned than how they looked in terms of their form. Most of the people in her sample did want an egalitarian relationship, both men and women. That wasn't everybody, but most of them did tend to want that relationship where men and women both balanced work and home life with their partners. However, they tended to have a plan B of what their second best option would be if this wasn't actually going to be feasible. So looking at slide number 8, they had fallback plans. The two columns on the left are women's ideals and men's ideals, and if we look, that light gray bar is egalitarian. Most men and women wanted an egalitarian relationship. More men than women, but still close to 70% of men wanted an egalitarian relationship. A pretty equal amount of them proportion wanted to be self-reliant, meaning that they could take care of themselves regardless of whether they were in a relationship or not. And then with neo-traditional, which we talked about a minute ago, we see almost twice as well. It looks like about twice as many men wanting neo-traditional than what women wanted. So that neo-traditional looks like kind of where this difference splits. Men and women both overwhelmingly want an egalitarian relationship. For both of them, a small amount want to be self-reliant. And that neo-traditional, which you can think of as the midpoint in terms of its definition and the ideals it portrays, it's the midpoint between egalitarian and self-reliant. We see more men leaning toward that than women. Okay, but what was their fallback position? Kind of realizing that their ideal may not pan out. We see basically women's fallback position and men's. Those are just going to be neo-traditional or self-reliant. We take out the egalitarian bar because, again, this is assuming that doesn't work out. We see basically, if you look at this, they're the inverse of each other pretty much. For most women, the fallback plan was to be self-reliant, and for most men, the fallback plan was a neo-traditional arrangement. Again, we do see some women wanting a neo-traditional arrangement. We do see some men wanting to be self-reliant. But this is pretty much reversed in terms of the proportions, that about 70% of women wanted to be self-reliant and about 70% of men wanted a neo-traditional arrangement. So that self-reliant would mean, you know what, go to school, go to grad school, get a good job, do whatever you need to do where you can take care of yourself and not have to be in a long-term relationship or not have to stay in an unhappy or dysfunctional long-term relationship. If it works out, it works out, but if it doesn't, then you can support yourself. And then for men, the ideal, if something egalitarian didn't work out, would be to essentially have an arrangement where his partner would be able to work, but the priority would be home and family. So summing all of this up, women, what was their fallback plan? They were torn between high hopes for combating work and family and worries about sustaining a lasting and satisfying partnership. I should backtrack and say that most of the participants did want some sort of long-term relationship, whether that was legal marriage or not. Most of them did have the ideal that they wanted to be in some sort of long-term relationship. So the proposed answer for women was self-reliance. They didn't view that as incompatible with a search for a life partner. So again, they were still open to finding a relationship and wanted to find a relationship, but they just wanted to know that they could care for themselves if that didn't work out, or not get stuck in a bad relationship, that if things weren't going well, they knew they could take care of themselves. So achieving independence made it possible to avoid settling for anything less than a satisfying mutually supportive bond. And this kind of goes back to early in the article, like some of the respondents who mentioned like being seeing a family, your family of origin may have been structurally cohesive, but if things weren't functional, people weren't getting along, they didn't want to reproduce that. Okay, men's fallback plans, they were torn between women's pressure for an egalitarian partnership and their own desire to succeed in a time-demanding workplace. So they did want their their wives or future partners' goals to be realized, but at the same time, knowing that if they contributed a lot of work to house and family, that would detract from their success in the marketplace. And this is a reality of kind of family life and the economy, that with having kids and parenting, that's a big task. And if you dedicate a lot of time to it, there are professional setbacks. And women experience those pretty frequently. So for instance, I delayed my PhD, completing my PhD around having kids. Academia is a very, very difficult place for women to have kids because it's very competitive. You're on a tenure clock. You have to make certain achievements each year. And so I remember being told early on, if you're a woman in academia and you want to have kids, most women honestly just don't have them in academia. It's one of the reasons I like Clemson is that most of the women who I met did have kids, and that's very, very different. The majority of women in academia do not have kids because it's very, very difficult. And so the advice I got was either have them in grad school or wait till you have tenure. And so I decided to have them in grad school. I didn't want to wait until, past a certain age where I really wanted to be having kids. And so I delayed graduating, and then I stayed in Nashville for a while locally because I didn't want to move my kids yet. And I took a very flexible position where I was able to be at home a lot with my kids. So I spent a lot of time with them in the first 3 years at home. And so these are things that delayed, me launching into a tenure track job. So these are decisions that women who go into professional fields make very frequently. And so men were thinking about that in their backup plan of not necessarily wanting to be in that position to have to make these decisions that might detract from their professional success. And so that's kind of the dilemma they ended up with, which is where they ended up with falling back on this neo-traditional arrangement, thinking like, I want my wife to be able to work, but she's going to have to do a lot of housework and childcare so that I can focus on my career. So then that was their proposed answer. It was this modified traditionalism, this neo-traditionalism that recognizes women's right to work, but puts the husband, father, male partner's professional goals ahead of hers. Full equality would be too costly for their careers. So, I mean, again, just kind of summarizing this up, this is basically just maybe these are, I don't know how to phrase this except to say that these are positions that women end up pretty frequently, women who are mothers and professionals. And so if men who were going to go into a full egalitarian situation would probably have to make those same types of decisions and end up in that same position. And so a lot of them then in the sample, their ideal was to, their fallback, their ideal was egalitarian, but their fallback was to go more to this neo-traditional arrangement. And so Gerson basically concludes we have this kind of new gender divide, essentially that men and women both tend to prefer an egalitarian situation. Not everybody. Again, if you look at those graphs, there are both men and women who strive for a traditional arrangement or neo-traditional as their first choice. But the overwhelming majority really want this egalitarian ideal, but it doesn't really typically work out. And in knowing that, young people are sort of coming up with these plan Bs, and we see a difference, not in the expectation. Overall, men and women both want the egalitarian ideal, but in how they handle their plan B. So for women, it would basically be like, I'm just going to be able to support myself just in case I don't find a partner who is where this egalitarian situation works out, don't find a partner where our relationship is happy and functional. And then for men, it tended to be to go to that neo-traditional norm of like, yeah, she doesn't have to be at home, she can work, but she's going to have to do more housework so that I can focus on my career. All right, so just summing all of this up, I think the big takeaway point from this whole lecture is looking at the difference between our norms and ideals. Men and women, for the most part, in terms of gender and family, are on the same, if not just similar pages in terms of what their expectations are, but we don't see that kind of working out with reality. And like I said, a lot of that, I mean, there are structural things in terms of, well, for instance, some employers will offer maternity leave but not paternity leave. So very early on, we're setting that expectation of what women and men do. That, you know, women can take parental leave, and by that I mean paid. I mean, legally everybody is permitted to take the unpaid time off if you either have a child through birth or through adoption. But in terms of employers who actually do offer those better plans where they pay you, a lot of times mothers are going to get it and fathers aren't. And so that's an example where just really early on we're setting that expectation of kind of what we expect men and women, mothers and fathers to be doing. And so for little reasons like that, I say little, that's actually, it feels pretty big when you're in the situation, but for when those reasons, things like that start to accumulate, that's when we really see these marked gender differences emerging. Like I mentioned, relationships without kids tend to be more egalitarian than the ones with, and a lot of that has to do with our expectations of mother and fathers, which a lot of us have internalized, and they're kind of our own norms and values at this point. And then a lot of it is this external stuff too about who's expected to do what. All right, I'm going to look at my little timer here on the camera and see. Oh, I talked longer than last time. Okay, sorry. You can fast forward, skip over places if you want. Sorry. Okay. It's still shorter than an hour and 15 minutes of class, but it's also not as fulfilling to listen to all your comments and get a discussion going. I'd like to hear kind of what your plans are. Like, do you plan to have kids? What do you want your relationship to look like? And what do you think it will actually look like compared to what your expectations are? Anyway, okay, I'm going to wrap this up. And I will post another little video for our next lecture next week. In the meantime, please remember that I have, at 2 o'clock, I'll log on to our little office hour link on Zoom. And I will hang out until 2:30. If nobody logs on by 2:30, then I'll just end the meeting. But if people are on, I'll stay on. So if you not even if you necessarily have questions about the readings, but if you just want to log on and say hi, I would enjoy seeing some of your faces. So feel free to do that. For any other reasons, send me emails or whatever. I really hate not being able to see you guys in class. I mean, It's nice not making the commute every day because I have an hour and a half commute, like I said, out from Atlanta. But I do miss being on campus, being in my office, and seeing all of you and talking to all of you. So pop in if you want virtually. And I'm actually looking forward to hopefully seeing some of you in the fall. By the way, I'm on the schedule for a special topics class on, I can't remember what we decided to call it. It's new. I think we changed the name to sexual assault and IPV. It's intimate partner violence. We were only allowed a certain number of letters for the course, so we had to shorten it to IPV. So if anybody's interested in that, there's going to be both a sociology and criminal justice section, so you can get appropriate credit for your field if you want to take it as an elective. And if you have questions, let me know. All right, I will talk to you next week. Enjoy your week.